Hi, it's Jamie from Friends of the Rainforest. You are about to enjoy a presentation given by Sophie and I on Earth Day about environmental justice and environmental racism. We provide definitions of both of these terms and explore some history and context for these issues in the United States and in the St. Louis area. While Sophie and I have a working knowledge in these topics, we are not experts. So, with that in mind, we're linking you to lots of different resources for further reading and education, as well as other amazing organizations to support in the St. Louis area and beyond. We encourage you to follow and support the work of Black and Indigenous environmentalists, as well as other leaders of color, and amplify calls for justice from folks who are most directly affected by these issues. If you support Friends of the Rainforest, we also encourage you to support some of these other organizations that we have linked, as well as engaging in direct giving and mutual aid in your communities. And last but not least, share what you've learned with other people in your family and in your community.
So before we go any further, Jamie is going to read our land acknowledgement.
Yeah. Before we started, since we are talking about environmental justice today, I wanted to start by acknowledging that Friends of the Rainforest operates on the ancestral territory of a few tribal nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Sac Fox peoples of Missouri. We operate on land stolen from these nations. This land acknowledgement recognizes that Indigenous Americans are the traditional guardians of the land, both past and present, and we want to recognize and support the sovereignty of and reparations to these nations.
Great. And so as we go through this presentation, if any questions come up, as I've said, feel free to interrupt me. You can also write your questions into the chat. And then we also have this form that I'm posting in our chat now that you are welcome to post your questions through. And the reason we're giving you this form option is because environmental justice and racism work can be intimidating subject matter if you're not familiar with it. So I don't want anyone to be deterred from asking a question because they're worried that it's a silly one. So hopefully the option of anonymity can help. And so to go off of that, I just want to say that there are no stupid questions. I'm not sure where everyone is as far as their familiarity with these topics, but no matter where you are, there's no stupid questions if you're here wanting to learn more. So this is meant to be kind of an environmental racism 101, like a crash course. And we're hoping to organize some presentations in the future that talk and touch on more complex topics under the environmental racism umbrella. But right now our focus is just kind of building up the foundation of knowledge on the topic. It's my instinct to look at your little icons with just your names as if I'm talking to you, but I'm like, oh yeah, you're not, that's you, that's okay. So quickly, we will just introduce ourselves first. So I am Sophie Arp. I am the development coordinator here at Friends of the Rainforest, and Jamie Casella is here, our education coordinator. We work with Friends of the Rainforest. So if you have joined us today, you've probably interacted with us in some capacity before. So you probably have some familiarity, but our work encompasses many different avenues. So I just wanted to give a brief overview in case you were unfamiliar with some of the other programs that we have. So we are a small nonprofit based out of St. Louis, Missouri, and our organization is me, Jamie, and our executive director, Chelsea, and then our board. So we're a very small organization, and our work really falls into three main categories. The first is our education program, which I will let Jamie tell you about in a moment, because she can go a bit more in depth about that. And then the others are our granting program. So we provide grants to organizations working directly with the rainforest. And our main partnership in that regard is with the Monteverde Conservation League in Costa Rica, working with the Children's Eternal Rainforest, which you see here in my picture. So last year we were able to grant them $88,000, and that was to help supplement their guard staff's salaries when they had to close their doors to tourists. So they saw a decrease in revenue, and so we helped keep the guard staff paid so they could keep the rainforest safe. And then we also provided them with money to finalize a land purchase to buy a portion of land that was previously privately owned. So the rainforest actually grew in 2020, which is a little victory of ours. And then the last part of our work is in normal times, we were able to send groups of students or families or what have you. We did a couple legacy tours on eco tours to the Children's Eternal Rainforest in Costa Rica. Those were put on hold throughout 2020 and 2021 so far, but we're feeling hopeful that we can start scheduling those again soon, hopefully beginning at the beginning of 2022. So we shall see, but I'll pass it on to Jamie now to discuss our education program.
Great, thanks, Sophie. So our education program has grown and changed considerably over the years. In the past, it's included storytelling and Montessori lessons from staff and board to now focused on hands-on lessons that are aligned with the next generation science standards. I joined this program in February 2020, right before the format of our education programs took another dramatic turn to stay accessible during the COVID-19 pandemic. When I started, we had a rotation of 5 main hands-on lessons, and I would bring materials to schools, predominantly public schools in the Rockwood and Parkway school districts out here in St. Louis County. Lessons ran about an hour long, depending on the class's needs. Then when the pandemic hit, I shifted a selection of our lessons online and adapted them to still allow students to participate with a wide range of hands-on materials from home or wherever they might be calling into school from. Sophie and I have worked hard to up our online presence as well as educational material on our YouTube channel, but this only really took us part way towards accessibility. In the summer, we formed the Education Equity Committee, which is a subcommittee of our Education Committee, which includes members from outside our organization with expertise in creating curriculum that centers equity and justice. And with their guidance, we've implemented new programs and tools from a lending library of materials that's accessible to the community, boxed lesson kits for virtual learners with materials in English and Spanish, post-lesson surveys for educators, making online content more accessible to blind and visually impaired folks, and more robust data tracking tools as we start to reach new audiences and new schools. Our goal is to begin to fill some of the opportunity gaps that the pandemic has created or exacerbated, and then to continue to connect rainforest conservation to the everyday lives and the local environments of our students. And just to give a quick plug, if you know someone in the St. Louis area or beyond with expertise in creating equity and justice centered curriculum, we are always looking for more members to add to this subcommittee, and we meet every other month.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. So if there are no questions so far, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, this presentation is going to be something like a 101. So we'll be giving brief overview definitions. We'll go into some examples nationally, but then focusing on the St. Louis area. And then we will end with some additional resources because we believe the Learning Fund should not stop here. So what is environmental racism and environmental justice? So we'll start with environmental racism. So environmental racism describes the way that environmental concerns disproportionately affect people of color, and especially in the US, Black communities and Indigenous communities specifically. So one of the most common, One of the most common skeptical responses that I've heard to environmental racism is, well, how can the environment be racist? And that is not what this is. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the way that, well, we're not talking about the environment deciding to react to climate change and industry in a way that is racist. We're talking about the systemic racism that is inherent in our society, that has set up our society in a way that puts communities of color more at risk to experience the consequences of climate change. So it's one of those concepts that once you recognize for what it is, you start to see examples everywhere. So, you know, it's which communities don't have access to clean water, which communities have big businesses plopping industrial plants in their neighborhoods. And so we'll go through some of those examples more in depth. And just to give a brief history, I suppose. Environmental racism is a concept that was coined in 1982 by a radical justice leader, Benjamin Chavis, and he defined environmental racism as racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, and the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements. And so we'll touch on that last point that he made as well. But so since then, environmental racism has been rightfully gaining more and more attention alongside just general anti-racist movements. Next slide.
Our second big term for today is environmental justice. So what do rectifying these issues look like? Environmental justice, this is a combination of definitions that I have found. This is the fair treatment, care, and environmental safety of all people, which inherently means uplifting and protecting communities of color and low-income communities most prone to environmental hazards. That is an integral part. People affected by environmental issues and injustices play a central role in developing solutions. So I share this definition because it differs slightly from the one given by the EPA Office of Environmental Justice. See if you can hear the difference. The definition from the EPA Office of Environmental Justice is: environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental health hazards and equal access to decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So the EPA Office of Environmental Justice was founded in 1992. In 1994, Bill Clinton wrote an executive order that specifically asked that attention be paid to communities of color and low-income communities so that they are not disproportionately harmed by environmental hazards. This executive order, however, did not go into effect, and in 2004, George W. Bush rewrote the office's goal to focus on all people. Technically, this was already the goal of the EPA, and a wonderful goal at that, but the de-emphasis of communities of color and low-income communities means that these groups no longer had the focused advocacy of the EPA, and the office became flooded with issues to work on, with various levels of severity in communities of various levels of need, and that slowed their response to the communities they were originally intended to serve.
So we will move on to some examples. So what does environmental racism look like? And we're going to go over, like I said, some local St. Louis examples and then beyond. And despite the order that these appear in, we're going to go beyond first. So I've written some of these examples in the form of questions. We'll go to the first one as an example: who has access to safe water and who doesn't? Putting them in these forms, for me, it's easier to think about it in this way, and framing these as questions always tends to lead me to more questions. So we will start here. Who has access to safe water and who doesn't? And I start with water because it's very often something that people who do have access to clean, safe drinking water can take for granted. And it goes beyond just drinking water, you know, it's your water to shower in or the water you flush your toilet with. And so not everyone has access. And so in a 2019 analysis of EPA data, it was found that race was the biggest determinant of whether or not a community had access to clean, safe water, and Indigenous communities were most likely to be without easy water access. So sometimes this can mean, driving 10 miles to the nearest water station to fill up and transport gallons of water back home. The Navajo Nation in the Southwest is one of the main examples to come up when looking into this. It's estimated that 15% of their nation doesn't have piped water in their homes. And this trend isn't exclusive to their community either. There's a Blackfoot community in East Glacier Park in Montana that had a boil order from 1994 to 2012. So for 18 years, they had a boil order on their water. Essentially, if you're unfamiliar, just if it's not safe enough to drink, so you have to boil it first. And so this lack of water has serious consequences, and the Navajo Nation was one of the areas hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, and Indigenous households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack access to basic indoor plumbing. And the reason for this is generally because when the plumbing infrastructure and the infrastructure boom was being implemented by cities and states in the 70s and 80s, these communities weren't included. And this is the same for, you find it in Latina communities in California or along other areas of the US-Mexico border, and in some low-income, like white communities in Appalachia as well. And I also just want to mention the Flint water crisis in Michigan here too. This was one of the most widely publicized public water crises in the US. And for those who aren't familiar, the Flint crisis began because the Flint officials wanted to save money by switching from Detroit's water supply to a new water supply that wasn't set up yet. So in that intermittent time, the time in between those two supplies, they started to take water from the Flint River. And this river was very contaminated and tested very high for lots of unwanted and unsafe bacteria. So the officials pumped chlorine into their water supply, which eroded the pipes and led to dangerous levels of lead in the water. So despite many accounts from citizens of the effects this lead was having on them and their health and their children's health, and the consequent protests that broke out, state officials claimed that the water was safe. And so Flint is one of the poorest cities in the US, and it's also predominantly Black. And there have been many studies and reports since their water crisis that were published after the fact that state that the cause of this crisis and why it was drawn out so long was systemic racism. And so this crisis was a result of continuous de-investment in the city. But this is also a good example of how environmental racism relates to deeper systemic racism. So not only were the Flint citizens subject to unsafe water, but the state was also incredibly slow to A, believe them, and B, do anything about it. And so that's another thing that you'll see as a common trend in a lot of these examples is there's the problem, whether it's the lack of water, the presence of mold, natural disasters, what have you. There's the problem, and then the problem is exacerbated by inaction by the government or responsible officials or just general indifference. So power plants are another really good example. And again, framing these as questions: where are the power plants being built? What neighborhoods, what areas are we putting industrial plants in? I have one case study that I'm going to focus on, but this issue is not exclusive to this case. We see cases like this across the US in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, East St. Louis is a good example. But the example I wanted to focus on was what is called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. So this is a 85-mile stretch along the banks of the Mississippi between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And this area is predominantly Black. And companies like ExxonMobil and Shell operate about 150 facilities here dealing with fossil fuels. So there was one report that 7 out of 10 census areas with the highest risk of cancer in the country are in this 85-mile stretch in Cancer Alley. And then the risk of cancer from air pollution is 95% higher than the rest of the country. And this is a pretty important example of racist placement of power plants because this area also used to be the home of plantations. And many of the people living here are direct descendants of the slaves who were forced to work there and are still living on this land that their great ancestors lived on. And so then these companies decide to put their incredibly toxic work shops and work facilities in this neighborhood. And so it's one of those things where it's like, it's not a coincidence. And these companies are still trying to build more plants and facilities here, but the citizens are fighting back. And right now they're currently working to stop the Formosa Plastics from building a new facility in St. James. And St. James is one of the river parishes in this area. And I'm going to go ahead and provide a link in the chat right now. If you'd like to learn more about it and help their cause, the last update that I read was that they were able to make Formosa put off the building of this new plastic facility until the COVID vaccination rollouts were completed. So this is something that's still ongoing and definitely something worth looking into and supporting their effort. It's a grassroots community-led movement against giant corporations. So it's nice to support them. So who's affected most by rising sea levels and natural disasters? This is another question that once you start thinking about it, just many examples can come up. So one good example that I found of this recently was in Miami. In Miami, there's a long history, particularly during the Jim Crow, era of racist policies for who has access to the beach and who cannot go there. And so there was actually a physical wall built between the Black communities there and the beach, because the beach was available for white people only. So white families and communities built their beachside properties, and Black and Latino communities were pushed inland. But then flash forward to today, when the rising sea levels are putting these white houses and communities at risk. So they're moving inland and beginning to gentrify these communities of color. So rent is increasing and the people of color are being pushed out of these communities that they've lived in for generations. For more examples, you can look at natural disasters. We can look at Hurricane Katrina, again in Louisiana, or Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And race and systemic racism play a huge role in the quality and speed of disaster relief in both of these cases and many others. And so while natural disasters don't discriminate, their long-term effects are disproportionately felt by people of color. So Miami is an interesting case study, but it's not always the white families who are housed on the beach. And especially if the area is high risk for flooding, then often racist housing practices will push communities of color to the front lines of natural disasters. And another small example that I tend to think of is tornadoes. Tornadoes tend to touch down in similar spots, and generally these locations can be found in neighborhoods of color. This is true of North City here in St. Louis, and I'm from Minneapolis originally, and that's also true of Minneapolis's north side. And who are we displacing for development? I'm trying to keep it brief because I don't want to take up the entire presentation, but this is something that I would encourage you all on your own time to read more about. I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview, but I think that this is very tragic, but definitely worth reading into more, because I'll give two examples, but there's so countless examples of this type of displacement for development. So in cities all over the US, you'll find that large inner city interstates, where you find those, you'll find a history of communities of color being pushed out of their homes and neighborhoods for the sake of building these interstates. And often this is purposefully done. And there's a very racist history of highway system development just in general. And these developments also tend to exacerbate segregation in many cities, with the highway kind of acting as a line between predominantly white and communities of color. Another interesting example of displacement, and I say interesting, but I feel like it's not really the correct word, because it is truly tragic, more than it is interesting. But Central Park is another example of this. Seneca Village was this neighborhood that was located in part of Central Park in the late 1800s, and it was predominantly Black, but there was also Irish immigrants and German immigrants there. And so when Central Park was being constructed, the city took this land away from this community through eminent domain and built the park over where what was a blossoming community lived. And there's examples like this everywhere, but that's another especially good thing to think about when looking at environmental work, because who are we pushing out and ignoring through like our green initiatives? Like who are our sustainability actions and movements benefiting, and who are they harming? Because you could argue that the creation of a park in a city is a wonderful thing, but that's where the environmental racism of it comes in, because who's benefiting from this park? Who is being pushed out in order for it to be created? So we'll briefly go over some St. Louis examples. I'm unsure if any of you are from St. Louis. I don't want to bore you in case you are not, but we will dive into these. So levels of lead are already high in St. Louis as compared to the rest of the state, but there are some clear differences in the community's exposure to lead. So I am basing all this information about St. Louis off of a 2019 report just called Environmental Racism in St. Louis. And actually, I will go ahead and link it in case you're interested. And I guess I should have said this at the beginning. We will be sending out these slides and all of the resources that we include in this report, as well as the video recording in case you'd like to check back in on it later. So this report found that Black children were 2.4 times more likely to have traces of lead found in their blood compared to white children in St. Louis. And 4 out of the 5 wards with the highest rates of lead poisoning were majority Black. And this is generally due to lead exposure from lead paint, and the older homes with lead paint are then found in more predominantly Black neighborhoods. But lead poisoning can cause permanent damage to the brain and nervous system and can slow a child's growth and development. We'll go through these kind of quickly. So mold. In 2018, 70% of the wards with 6 or more interior mold complaints were majority Black. And mold is a really tricky problem because it's incredibly expensive to remove. So even just an inspection, and this isn't the removal, it's just coming in to inspect the mold, can run up over $1,000. So, there's also the issue of income equality, uncaring landlords, et cetera, that can all worsen this problem. And mold exposure is bad because it can worsen sinus congestion, sore throats, coughs, chest tightness, nosebleeds, et cetera. And the one thing you'll notice from these maps, and I can go back, is that all these high mold and high lead areas are mostly found in North City in St. Louis, as well as along the interstate of 55 going into South City, which is kind of that area there to the west. And again, that's something that is not a coincidence. So pollution, St. Louis has been in violation of the federal health air standard for ozone since 1979. So that's not great, but this comes back to our earlier example of just where are power plants located and where are we putting our industry facilities. So, and another cause of air pollution is building demolitions. They can be very harmful to the air quality if not done right, and they can send harmful dust into the environment and can also spread lead and asbestos through the air. And so more building demolitions take place in North City and Dutchtown neighborhood than any other part of the city. And these are 2 areas with a really high concentration of Black residents. So again, it's matching the same type of patterns that you see for everything else. And then access to healthy food is one of the last things that I'd like to talk about. Black residents in St. Louis are almost twice as likely to have limited access to healthy foods as white residents. And this is due to a lack of nearby grocery stores or lack of adequate public transportation to get to those grocery stores. If either of you are from St. Louis, I was recently volunteering with Urban Harvest at the new Rung facility in Fox Park, and they pointed out that Fox Park is in fact a food desert, which I had never thought about it in that way before. But it's just one of those neighborhoods where there's no local grocery stores, there's no smaller chains, even like a shop and save type of place is still over a mile away. But so that's just another thing to be mindful and think about, who has access to healthy foods, where are supermarkets, who are these supermarkets catering to, etc. So that concludes my very long drawn out examples portion. So now Jamie will take us further.
Well, first of all, props to Sophie for going through all of that. Go drink a glass of water. And thank you both for sticking with us so far. So now that you have a little bit of background and context and history for some of these issues, I wanted to leave you with some resources and some action items. I want to point out once again that Friends of the Rainforest is not an environmental justice organization. Sophie and I, while we have knowledge in this area and can absolutely get you started, your education does not stop with us. And you, congratulations now by being here, you have taken on the responsibility of learning more. So the first big resource is, of course, the Environmental Racism Report in St. Louis, published in 2019. It's 20 pages, lots of graphics and photos. So it really is a quick read, and it gives an outline on kind of the multitude of environmental discrepancies that we see here in the city that we operate. And here are some of the collaborators on this report, the folks who joined forces to create this incredible resources are Action St. Louis, Arch City Defenders, Dutchtown South Community Cooperation, and the Sierra Club. So moving on to more resources, the Environmental Justice Self-Study Guide by Wash U is an awesome collection of resources. They speak on environmental justice and environmental racism kind of to varying depths. At the top of the page is a 3-minute video that gives just kind of a brief history to listeners and watchers of environmental justice, protests, and legal battles in modern US history, starting with Warren County and then in the 80s and then moving forward. So that is an awesome resource. EJ Screen is it's the EPA's data mapping tool that shows environmental health and environmental hazards with demographic data. So it allows you to kind of navigate across the country and see kind of these different discrepancies and where they pop up. And then, of course, the NCAAP Environmental and Climate Justice Resources is a robust list of reading for you all to explore. Some organizations to support I've kind of listed based on region. In the US, Outdoor Afro celebrates and inspires Black connections with and leadership in nature. They host events for Black environmentalists and community members to enjoy the outdoors together in community. Latino Outdoors has a similar mission for Latino Latinx communities. Both organizations focus on creating spaces that honored shared historical and present experiences, knowledge of outdoor spaces unique to these communities. The Missouri Coalition for the Environment has worked on a number of initiatives from its beginning in 1969, from park planning to preventing the building of the Merrimack Dam to opposing the I-170 expansion. And then in St. Louis, a couple of organizations of many wonderful organizations are the Fit and Food Connection, which is a St. Louis-based organization working to increase access to fresh foods for low-income community members. Known and Grown expands farmers' platforms with their online local food locator tool. So in this way, they're able to connect buyers to their food and to the farmers growing their food. And then Heru Urban Farming is a Black-led urban organic farm that also teaches community members about organic farming practices in a way that is both culturally responsive and respectful of farming traditions. And then some social media accounts to follow. Again, highlighted just a few of many incredible resources, of which I know Sophie and I could each share so many more with you. New Roots Urban Farm here in St. Louis, City Greens Co-op does a lot of food justice work. Let's see here, I'm having a hard time reading on the screen. Queer Brown Vegan. Um, I'm going to ask you to pronounce this person's name, Sophie. I think you added this name down in here.
I would think it's Michaela Loach, but I guess I've never actually heard it out loud. She's just somebody that I follow on Instagram and posts a
Gotcha.
lot of environmental justice work and good things to know.
Awesome. And then Black Forager is just an awesome, entertaining expert in foraging foods found here in the Midwest. So please check out all of these resources, continue to seek out opportunities for education, seek out education from BIPOC community leaders and experts. Your work does not stop with us.
And one thing that I'd also like to encourage you both to do is, take the information that you've learned today and go tell two other people. Take the most fun fact. None of them are fun. Take the most interesting, moving fact that you learned and go, share this with somebody and start those conversations with your communities and your peer groups. And it all starts with us and just talking about these issues. So I think
Before we go, I wanted to give one quick plug, another action step. A lot of these organizations are organizations that you can donate to if you choose on Earth Day or beyond. And I also want to give a quick plug to St. Louis Mutual Aid. Their Instagram makes direct giving to families in need really easy. People post appeals for what they need. A lot of times you'll notice it is related to these environmental health discrepancies that we see in our city. Whether someone who is looking for safe and secure housing, someone who's having trouble meeting their medical bills, direct giving to people who need it is the most effective way to help folks out. So if you are not in St. Louis, most major cities and most communities by now have some kind of social media account where you can follow, and it will link you to direct giving campaigns for individuals and families.
And Jamie does bring up a point that we kind of touched on but didn't explicitly point out, which is that when talking about environmental racism, it's almost impossible to separate it from other systemic races, policies that we see. So whether it's racism in the healthcare industry or racism in housing, it's all connected. And I would definitely encourage you both to, read up more on environmental racism, but expand it and, whatever area that, strikes your interest the most, dive into it and share what you learn. If anyone has any questions, this would be the appropriate time, but that is absolutely okay if there's no questions at all. Again, we will be sending you links to all of these resources and this recording and the slides and everything. It will likely be tomorrow or at some point over the weekend and not tonight, but we'd still, encourage you to go out and seek some further information and find an organization that speaks to you and show them a little love on this Earth Day. But yeah, with that being said, let's see, I'm going to stop my sharing. And thank you both so much for joining us. And we will see you another time.